The silence that usually surrounds Moscow's central avenues did not hold today. From the first hours of this day, streams of people began to fill the streets, not in scattered groups, but in measured, determined columns. Official channels called it a public disturbance. Yet, by all indications, what unfolded resembled something much larger, a political rupture that few dared to name aloud. According to information received throughout the day, the tension between the state and society, long accumulating beneath the surface, has reached a point where even loyal structures began to waver. What was announced as a limited gathering rapidly turned into the largest display of disobedience in recent years. At this hour, reports from multiple regions indicate simultaneous rallies, spontaneous, uncoordinated, but united by a single emotion, exhaustion. The official statements emphasize that order is under control. But in the background, footage and testimonies suggest otherwise. In some cities, local administrations refrained from dispersing the crowds, opting instead to monitor the situation. In expert circles, this is interpreted as a signal of internal hesitation. Between the lines of each announcement, there is a sense that the vertical of power, long considered monolithic, is beginning to fracture under its own weight. According to our sources, the key turning point came when several prominent figures, previously associated with the ruling bloc, publicly called for dialogue. That word alone, dialogue, had not been used in official discourse for years. In the language of the system, it sounded almost like defection. Still, the reaction from the Kremlin remained restrained. Spokespersons limited themselves to formulas of routine, provocations, foreign interference, attempts to destabilize. However, behind these familiar words, observers detected a shift in tone, less confidence, more uncertainty. Meanwhile, the scale of the demonstrations is difficult to verify. State broadcasters have reduced coverage to brief updates, while social networks continue to circulate fragmented videos and live recordings. Independent verification is impossible, but one pattern is clear: the movement has no visible leaders. It grows horizontally, bypassing traditional structures, feeding on itself. In the analytical community, such dynamics are seen as the most unpredictable form of political pressure, one that the system finds hardest to contain. But the most telling details are not in the streets, but in the institutions. Throughout the day, signs of internal coordination failure became visible. Some government agencies issued contradictory statements, others temporarily restricted access to official data portals. Unconfirmed reports suggest that several regional heads have requested emergency consultations. At first glance, it looks like bureaucracy under stress. But at a deeper level, experts describe it as the first symptom of disalignment within the command chain. And that, according to insiders, is far more serious than the protests themselves. Still, the narrative presented to the public remains uniform: stability, legality, calm. Yet, in private discussions, among diplomats, financiers, and political strategists, another phrase circulates: point of irreversibility. It is not being said openly, but the meaning is clear. The old formula of control, based on fear and routine, is weakening. And when such formulas start to collapse, history tends to accelerate. Perhaps it is worth following closely what happens next. Some sources believe that today is not the culmination, but only the prelude to a deeper internal split. Because sometimes the line between a protest and a political realignment becomes visible only when it's already been crossed. By midday, the official narrative began to diverge from reality. Government briefings framed the demonstrations as isolated provocations, limited to a few districts. Yet the data gathered by monitoring groups told a different story. From provincial centers to industrial towns, crowds kept forming, silent, persistent, disciplined. According to information obtained throughout the day, several thousand people had already been detained, though the numbers were neither confirmed nor denied by authorities. The pattern of detentions revealed something unusual. The police focused less on dispersing gatherings and more on blocking communication channels. Analysts interpreted this as a sign of shifting priorities, from control of the streets to control of the narrative. In the early statements of the security agencies, the word stability appeared with increasing frequency. Each repetition sounded like reassurance, yet also like an echo of unease. In the expert environment, such linguistic uniformity is usually considered an indicator of coordinated messaging, a tactic used when internal clarity is lacking. Between the lines of these communiques, one could read what was not being said aloud, that the government was facing not a protest, but a legitimacy test. The apparatus, accustomed to vertical command, found itself dealing with a horizontal force it could neither predict nor suppress fully. As the day progressed, small but telling contradictions surfaced. Regional officials in several areas released statements that contradicted federal ones, acknowledging the unprecedented scale of public concern. Some later deleted their messages, citing technical errors. In the bureaucratic language of the system, such reversals are not random. According to sources familiar with internal coordination, the confusion indicated disagreements over how far to escalate the response. Some within the administration reportedly advocated for restraint, fearing a nationwide backlash. Others demanded decisive action. The absence of a unified tone suggested more than tactical hesitation, it hinted at cracks in consensus. Meanwhile, the streets continued to fill. By early afternoon, central squares in several major cities were occupied by dense, immovable crowds. Despite the heavy presence of security forces, the overall behavior of protesters remained calm. Observers described an atmosphere of quiet defiance, not aggression, but determination. There were no chants, no banners, only handwritten signs with short, restrained messages. In previous years, such gatherings would have been dispersed within minutes. This time, the line between enforcement and observation seemed intentionally blurred. Officials called it de-escalation. Insiders called it uncertainty. In expert circles, the discussion has already moved beyond the surface of events. The term civil resistance began to appear in analytical reports, cautiously, without direct attribution. It is too early to define what is happening as a civil conflict, but the dynamics, according to several political analysts, mirror early stages of systemic fragmentation. What makes this moment exceptional is not the number of participants, but the erosion of predictability. The institutions once perceived as unshakable are now operating in reactive mode, adapting to signals rather than setting them. Officially, nothing extraordinary is taking place. Routine security measures, isolated incidents, limited gatherings, the same formulas are being repeated across every broadcast. Yet the absence of visible control mechanisms suggests that something deeper is being recalibrated. The power structure, long accustomed to absolute coherence, is encountering a new variable, spontaneity. And in systems built on control, spontaneity is the most dangerous element of all. By this point, the country's information space had become a field of contradictions. State channels emphasize calm, independent platforms show tension, and between them, a wide, growing silence. That silence, experts say, is the most revealing signal. Because when the state stops commenting, it is often not because it has nothing to say, but because it no longer knows how to define what is happening. In the background of this silence, the sense of unease continues to grow. Between the words of officials and the actions of citizens, a new space is forming, undefined, unstable, and impossible to reverse without consequence. The question now is not how many will join the protests, but how many inside the system will choose not to stop them. And that, as analysts quietly warn, is where the real shift begins. By this stage of the day, something imperceptible but decisive began to unfold inside the system itself. While the images of the protests dominated external attention, the real tension moved behind closed doors, into offices, command centers, and communication channels between ministries. According to information obtained throughout the day, several key institutions were placed under special coordination protocols, limiting access even for senior officials. The official explanation referred to technical optimization. In expert circles, however, this was described as an internal containment measure, a discreet attempt to prevent miscommunication among the power blocks. At first glance, it might have looked like routine bureaucracy under stress. But insiders suggest that the situation went far beyond administrative tension. Some sources close to security structures quietly confirmed that parts of the apparatus began to act autonomously, without awaiting central directives. That subtle but critical shift, from hierarchy to autonomy, is what analysts define as the first sign of fragmentation. Officially, nothing was admitted. But the pattern of statements, the abrupt pauses in public communication, and the synchronized silence of key media outlets all pointed to a single fact: control was no longer total. The tone of internal messaging also changed. In previous crises, the language of command had been decisive, almost ritualistic. Today it sounded hesitant. Instructions were revised, orders delayed, briefings postponed. Between those intervals, decisions began to surface at regional levels, improvised, uncoordinated, sometimes directly contradicting federal guidelines. In the bureaucratic lexicon of the state, such asynchronous actions mark a phase when institutions start operating on instinct rather than instruction. And that phase, according to political observers, is when a managed system begins to turn on itself. Between the official calm and the unofficial disarray, one particular question circulated in policy circles: who exactly is giving orders now? There was no clear answer. Spokespersons repeated pre-written lines about operational stability, yet the absence of visible leadership during the largest internal crisis in years did not go unnoticed. Several insiders reported that communication lines between central agencies and regional administrations were restructured. In practice, that often means one thing: parallel channels of authority emerging within the same system. In political terminology, that is called dual power. Meanwhile, the protests continued to evolve, but in a way that even their participants might not fully grasp. What began as a visible expression of dissent had become a mirror reflecting something deeper: the disconnection between the language of the state and the emotions of its citizens. Officially, both sides are still speaking, but their words no longer meet in the same reality. That psychological gap, analysts warn, is more dangerous than any crowd. Once established, it rarely closes. In the afternoon, the first reports emerged of spontaneous cooperation between citizens and local law enforcement, quiet gestures of restraint, mutual avoidance of confrontation. On the surface, it looked like exhaustion. In reality, it was a tacit recognition of shared limits. Neither side appeared willing to cross a line that could turn the demonstrations into open conflict. Yet, as insiders note, such balance cannot hold indefinitely. It either resolves into dialogue or collapses into division. And dialogue, in the current climate, remains a forbidden word. Between these silent exchanges and the absence of directives, a vacuum began to form, not of power, but of purpose. Within that void, alternative centers of coordination started to appear, informal networks of officials, academics, and professionals exchanging information privately. Their goal was not confrontation, but survival. To maintain continuity amid uncertainty. To preserve the structure, even if the hierarchy falters. According to analysts, such behavior signals the transition from loyalty to self-preservation. And once that threshold is crossed, the idea of a united state becomes theoretical. At this point, even the most cautious voices in the expert community have stopped using the phrase temporary unrest. They speak instead of a systemic realignment. The difference is subtle but profound. One implies correction, the other, transformation. And while official statements continue to insist on control, the rhythm of events tells another story. The system is no longer responding to commands. It is reacting to itself. Observers close to administrative circles suggest that what happens in the next few hours will determine whether this remains a political crisis or becomes something deeper, an identity fracture. Some have already begun calling it a cold civil phase, where confrontation manifests not in violence, but in paralysis. At the moment, that paralysis feels almost invisible. Yet those watching closely understand, silence inside a rigid system is never neutral. It means forces are repositioning. Perhaps that is why many within the analytical community now advise one thing: to follow the developments quietly, without interpretation, until the pattern becomes visible. Because what appears as disorder on the surface may, in reality, be the birth of a new order beneath it. And those who observe carefully enough will sense it first. By this moment, the calm that officials tried to project had started to erode. Reports circulated of disruptions in regional administrations, unexplained resignations, and abrupt disappearances from public schedules. According to information gathered throughout the day, several governors refrained from appearing in planned press briefings, citing coordination issues. At the same time, security units were observed relocating between major cities without public notice, movements officially described as preventive measures. In analytical circles, such precautions are interpreted differently, as a signal that loyalty is no longer assumed, but verified. The state's information architecture also began to strain. News agencies received new directives limiting the use of the words mass protest and public gathering, replacing them with neutral phrases like movement of citizens. Yet these linguistic substitutions could not mask the scope of events. By now, the demonstrations had evolved into something that resembled a civic pulse, steady, unyielding, impossible to suppress without visible force. The absence of visible force, however, had its own meaning. According to insiders, the top command is caught between two imperatives: to maintain the image of control and to avoid triggering irreversible escalation. In that narrow space between action and inaction, the structure itself is starting to warp. At the same time, there are signs of an emerging division among elites. Financial circles, typically cautious and silent, have begun quietly moving capital abroad, not in panic, but in anticipation. Several major investment entities have halted long-term projects, waiting for clarity of policy. Such pauses rarely occur spontaneously. In expert discussions, this behavior is treated as an economic referendum, a silent vote of no confidence. When capital retreats, it is not out of fear, but out of knowledge that stability has become performative. Officially, the rhetoric remains unchanged: the situation is under full control. Yet every repetition of that phrase feels heavier, as though the weight of reality is pressing against it. The number of unconfirmed reports has multiplied, some about mutinies inside administrative departments, others about temporary communication blackouts between ministries. No one can verify them, and perhaps verification no longer matters. In systems built on secrecy, the absence of confirmation is itself a confirmation. In diplomatic circles, cautious statements have begun to surface. Several international missions have temporarily adjusted their staffing levels, a formula usually reserved for unstable environments. Privately, diplomats describe the mood as opaque uncertainty. In plain terms, no one knows who will speak on behalf of the state tomorrow. Such uncertainty reverberates far beyond politics. It reaches the economy, the energy sector, the markets that depend on predictability. Yet inside the country, predictability is the first casualty of this day. Meanwhile, the streets have changed their rhythm. The early surge of emotion has subsided, replaced by a quieter, more deliberate presence. People are not leaving, they are waiting. Waiting for something to happen, or for someone to speak. The silence from the top has become deafening. In psychological terms, this is the most dangerous phase of any internal crisis, when the crowd stops reacting and starts expecting. Because expectation creates vacuum, and vacuum invites alternative voices. Those voices are already emerging, softly, cautiously, through encrypted channels and whispered statements. Not leaders, not parties, just fragments of a future that has not yet declared itself. In analytical departments, a new term began circulating late in the day, phase of redefinition. It describes a situation where the political system, unable to adapt to pressure, begins to dissolve and reassemble in real time. Some experts compare it to a controlled collapse, not an explosion, but a slow folding inward. The key feature of such a phase is silence. The fewer the words, the more irreversible the changes. By this definition, the events unfolding now fit the model precisely. Between the official calm and the spreading disquiet, one phrase from an internal memo stands out: maintain operational continuity at any cost. The meaning is ambiguous. Continuity of what? Authority, or denial? According to observers familiar with past crises, when a government begins speaking in terms of continuity rather than stability, it has already accepted that stability is gone. What remains is procedure, the mechanical persistence of a system whose logic has already expired. However, beneath this mechanical persistence, a different force is forming, unorganized yet coherent, fragmented yet unified by purpose. It is not political, but existential. It is the quiet understanding, shared across opposing sides, that the old order no longer governs the same country. That realization does not require speeches or symbols, it reveals itself in behavior, in hesitation, in the refusal to act as before. Insiders describe this moment as the threshold, the instant when institutions recognize their own irrelevance faster than they can reform. Officially, there is no civil war. Unofficially, the war has shifted inward, into structures, departments, consciences. The front line is invisible, but it runs through every decision-maker forced to choose between command and reason. And those choices, multiplied across the system, are already rewriting the reality of the state. But beyond these walls of control, the movement continues. It no longer resembles a protest, it resembles a reckoning. And those who still watch from the outside can sense it. The transformation is no longer a question of will, but of time. By this point in the day, the rhythm of events had slowed, but the air itself seemed charged with something unresolved. The streets that had echoed with movement now stood in a tense stillness. There were no more chants, no visible confrontations, only a collective pause, as though the country itself was holding its breath. Officially, calm had returned. Unofficially, it was the calm of exhaustion, not resolution. In analytical departments, this phase is often described as the plateau of uncertainty, a fragile balance between retreat and awakening. Yet, by all expert assessments, the system that began this day is no longer the same one standing now. According to information received throughout the afternoon, a number of internal meetings were convened in emergency format. Their agendas remain undisclosed, though insiders mention discussions of transitional stability mechanisms. The phrasing itself marks a quiet admission: the architecture of governance has entered adaptation mode. What was once presented as unshakable unity now requires maintenance. And maintenance, in political terms, means fragility. In the background, decisions are being made, not to strengthen control, but to prevent collapse. For the first time in years, the state appears to be reacting, not dictating. In the financial and diplomatic sectors, the signals are equally telling. Currency fluctuations remain contained, yet capital flight continues. Foreign missions refrain from commentary, yet their silence carries weight. Markets have learned to read silence as a statement. Inside the country, institutions are likewise learning to function without waiting for central approval. Officials who once relied on directives now rely on instinct. This shift may appear administrative, but in reality, it signifies the beginning of political decentralization, the silent redistribution of authority across a fractured landscape. Meanwhile, in the expert community, the language of description is changing. The word protest is no longer used, it has been replaced by process. Analysts emphasize that the confrontation is no longer external, it is internalized, institutional, and psychological. The old mechanisms of coercion remain, but their emotional leverage has faded. Fear, once the system's most reliable instrument, no longer behaves predictably. Across the apparatus, subtle acts of hesitation, pauses, delays, omissions, now speak louder than decrees. In such an environment, control becomes performance, and performance becomes denial. At the same time, the population's behavior has taken on a new quality, not of defiance, but of endurance. Citizens no longer wait for instructions or reforms, they simply continue, as if the authority above them had already ceased to exist in practical terms. This quiet autonomy, spreading without slogans or structure, is the most profound shift of all. In the language of analysts, it represents the post-obedience stage, a condition in which governance persists formally, but not functionally. Official power remains visible, but its reflection no longer reaches the ground. Throughout the day, no single event defined the crisis, yet every small detail carried the weight of transformation. A cancelled press briefing. An unspoken resignation. A muted broadcast. Together, these fragments form the outline of a system rearranging itself in silence. Experts describe it as an internal reconfiguration, neither revolution nor reform, but something slower, deeper, and more permanent. The state is not collapsing, it is mutating. Its new form will emerge not through declarations, but through behavior, through the way it now hesitates, recalibrates, and quietly concedes space it can no longer control. By this hour, the narrative that began as a protest has turned into a question: who governs when no one commands? The answer, for now, remains suspended in uncertainty. Yet in that uncertainty lies a rare moment of clarity, the realization that authority, once absolute, is now dispersed among millions of individual decisions being made in silence. According to political analysts, this is how systemic transformations begin, not with explosions, but with pauses that last too long to be ignored. Officially, life continues as before. The government insists on stability, the streets remain under observation, communication networks are functioning. But beneath this veneer, the foundational contract between state and society, obedience in exchange for order, has begun to dissolve. What replaces it is still undefined, but it is already present, shaping behavior, rewriting expectations, redrawing the invisible borders of control. Some insiders describe the mood inside institutions as measured detachment. Others call it the beginning of a long silence. In both interpretations, the message is the same: a cycle has ended, and another has begun, though no one dares to name it yet. In expert circles, the consensus is cautious, that the political equilibrium has entered a self-correcting phase, one that will unfold not in days or weeks, but in habits, in language, in tone. Perhaps that is why many observers now advise the same: to keep watching quietly. Because moments like this, when an entire structure hesitates, rarely announce themselves as historic. They simply pass through the day, unnoticed by those who expect noise. Yet, as those who read signals understand, history does not always break, sometimes it dissolves. And as the lights dim across the administrative skyline, the silence that follows is no longer absence of sound. It is presence, dense, deliberate, and irreversible. Those who sense it know, what has been seen today cannot be unseen. And from this silence, something new is already beginning to form.